Welcome to Natu Reads, an audio library of revolutionary texts. Our Road by the Poor Peasants League, Part 2. (4) The Agrarian Question. Many scholars of the land question in our country, and political parties that define themselves as socialist and even communist, have defended that an agrarian reform in the country is no longer necessary to solve the problem of the production of food and raw materials, alleging that, today, the solution of these problems is guaranteed with agro-industry, the so-called, quote, agro-business, end quote, as Rede Globo boasts, quote, the wealth industry of Brazil, end quote, with the application of modern techniques, new technologies, and advanced equipment, and that the need for agrarian reform only arises because of the social problem of great inequalities and marginalization of millions of Brazilians, and, therefore, any reform is enough. Such conclusions do not correspond to reality. First, because the large production where the most modern resources are applied is export-oriented and based on monoculture, concentrated in the central southern and central western regions, occupying the best lands. Second, by following the dictates of monopolistic capital, it is focused on obtaining maximum profit, and not on satisfying the needs of the country and the population. Third, as a consequence, the much publicized grain production, with its record harvests, has only resulted in a deformation of the national economy and the deepening of the country's dependency. Its per capita ratio, 720 kilograms per person per year, is far below international standards. Unquestionably, the country's basic food supply is provided by small and medium-sized properties, increasingly subjected to the most complete exploitation by the agro-industry. It is not a matter, therefore, of carrying out a, quote, agrarian reform, end quote, to develop capitalism in the countryside, which is how the agrarian question has always been approached in the country, because capitalism penetrated the countryside through the bureaucratic path, maintaining the semi-feudal relations through the evolution of their forms, both in the relations of land ownership as in the other social and cultural relations derived from them. The high concentration of land in the country, 1% of the landowners own almost 50% of the land, while the 91% own only 20% of it, has been accentuated, and the more capitalism penetrates into the countryside, the more this tendency accelerates. Even the growth of the agro-industry itself has not meant an increase in the agricultural labor force, around 4.5 million. The use of modern machinery has drastically reduced the number of jobs, as exemplified by the sugarcane region of Ribeirão Preto for the production of sugar and alcohol, and the growing use of archaic forms of exploitation of the labor force as semi-servants in the traditional crops of coffee and others. Although the national economy is no longer essentially agricultural, as it was 40 years ago, total agricultural production has reached almost 40% of the GDP, the labor force directly linked to agricultural production exceeds 50 million people. The country continues to import large quantities of food, and the application of new technologies, equipment, inputs, fertilizers, poisons, etc., have accentuated in an exponential manner the country's dependence on foreign capital, which in turn has come to dominate agro-industry as well. The concentration of land in Brazil has historically contributed to the maintenance and aggravation of the economic and social crisis by constituting the base for sustaining this bureaucratic capitalism, contributing decisively to the maintenance of a colossal reserve army, the existence of a permanently ruined peasant economy that serves to supply food, replacement of the labor force exploited by the capitalist, and raw materials to industry that have been fundamental factors in obtaining high rates of profit for the bourgeoisie, for the formation of financial capital, and today, more than ever, as the generating source of the mass of excluded people and of an enormous peasantry. Finally, as a result, it functions as a brake on the proletariat struggle and an element in its disorganization. The modernization of agriculture, which occurred mainly in the last 42 years, was based on large properties, monoculture and export-oriented agriculture, coffee, sugarcane, soy, tobacco, cacao, orange juice, and cotton, concentrated in the central south and central west regions around the most industrialized areas of the country, increasing the concentration of land and expelling, in different ways, the rural workers. Furthermore, the growing use of mechanization, automation, improved seeds, and the systematic use of fertilizers and different types of poisons has violently increased foreign dependence, since the state and national petrochemical, machine, and implement industries have either been privatized and handed over to the monopolies or liquidated completely, with Monsanto, Cargill, Agroceres, Massey Ferguson, etc. reigning freely. The violence of the latifundium. Consequently, the concentration of land has historically been the main cause of the acute social inequality and extreme misery of millions of peasant families, of the swelling of the big cities, of the marginalization, hunger, misery, and permanent violence that befalls the poor of the countryside. In the resistance struggle against their expulsion from the land, or to conquer it, the peasants faced the most systematic and prolonged violence unleashed by the old reactionary Brazilian state, and by the paramilitary bands of the landowners, with their criminal cover-up through the so-called, quote, justice, end quote, in the most shameless impunity that further increases the savagery of the dominant classes. As shown in the table below, the violence with deaths continues to increase over the last decades, which reveals the intensification of repressive action by the old state, combined with the armed wing of the latifundium, as occurred in the massacre of Corumbiara, El Dorado dos Carajás, among others, where the eviction was carried out by PM troops, together with gunmen, who even wore police uniforms. The 8 years of FHC's and Luiz Inácio's governments, apart from the great publicity on agrarian reform, reveal themselves as mere administrative managements of the old state of the big bourgeoisie and landlords that have protected the interests of the reactionaries with fire and iron. Table: Violence in Brazil's countryside. 1976 to 1991, over 1,000 murders. 1991 to 1995, 268 murders. 1995 to 2002, 292 murders. 2003 to 2013, 403 murders. 2013 to 2017, 251 murders. Approximated data. Source: National Press, CPT. This whole picture constitutes a fundamental factor in the gearing of the system dominated by international finance capital, keeping the country in a permanent whirlpool of economic crisis, deepening the social crisis in a frightening way, with hunger for millions, misery, violence, and death. Therefore, the agrarian question is a central question and of fundamental importance not only for peasants, but for all workers, for the middle classes, and for the independence and progress of the nation. The 4 pillars of the fundamental transformations of Brazilian agriculture. In addition to starting from the immediate and general demands of the different sectors of rural workers, small producers, and temporary salaried workers, like the, quote, boias frias, end quote, where various forms of servile and semi-servile relations reign under the formal name of salaried workers, relations that the legislation of the old state calls, quote, analogous to slave labor, end quote, issues that are already present in the general program of proletarian resistance. Considering that the fundamental and basic agrarian issue is the question of land ownership, the agrarian program to achieve the required radical transformations presupposes the total destruction of the latifundium and the immediate handing over of land parcels to the poor, landless, or nearly landless peasants. To achieve this goal, the peasants can only count on their own forces in the first place, and with the decisive support of the urban and rural proletariat. This is a radical struggle that has no room for conciliation. It is in itself a question of political power. In the historical and present conditions of the organization of poor peasants, this conquest becomes completely impossible to be accomplished overnight, and will demand a long time and protracted process. Therefore, the peasants should not renounce this program in exchange for the promises and crumbs offered by the bourgeoisie and the opportunists with their make-believe agrarian reforms. They must fight right now, as they are doing, for the application of this program in the areas taken over from the latifundium, until the complete conquest in the whole country of the great democratic transformations is finally concluded, initiating a new stage of total nationalization, state ownership, and collectivization of the lands, defended and applied by the peasant movement itself. 1. Destruction of the latifundium and handing over of the land to the landless or nearly landless poor peasants. 2. Liberation of the productive forces of the countryside in the areas taken from the latifundium, through the elimination of all relations of production based on the exploitation of man through the adoption of cooperative forms. The organization and associative forms of the plots in different levels of cooperation according to their experience, from mutual aid groups, an elementary form, to higher forms of cooperation, passing through other levels of cooperative forms. Adoption of more advanced means of production and working tools, and of the most modern techniques. Cooperative organization of the system of production, distribution, commercialization, supply and exchange between the various areas and regions, of the infrastructure such as warehouses, transport, roads, bridges, basic sanitation, etc. 3. Organization and exercise of the political power of the masses in the seized areas. Organization of the various forms of participation of the masses at the different levels for decision-making and the embryo of their self-government, People's Assembly and the People's Committee. Organization of cultural life and its various manifestations. Organization of a mass self-defense system. Organization of the new People's School based on the 3 principles of study, work, and struggle for scientific research, production, and class struggle to liquidate illiteracy and promote the elevation of the scientific and technical knowledge of all. Organize a people's system of preventative and curative health, polyclinics. 4. Immediate defense of the future nationalization of the big rural capitalist enterprises and the control of their production and management by the workers when the new power is established in the regions where they are installed. 5. The quilombola and the indigenous question. The indigenous problem in our country is part of the set of great national and democratic problems. In order to understand it correctly, it is necessary to investigate and study it. However, we could not fail from the outset to take a clear position with regard to it. We recognize that the indigenous problem is not merely a question of the right to land demarcation. The indigenous problem, the problem of the original peoples of these lands, is a problem of nationalities, and today, more than ever, is the problem of national minorities oppressed by the old Brazilian state of big bourgeois and landlords, servants of imperialism. The indigenous populations that today number more than 700,000 are the result of a long heroic and tragic resistance against the culture of domination, exploitation, destruction, and genocide of the white colonizers, the great lords of misappropriated lands, the great merchants, the big bourgeoisie, and the imperialists. We uphold, in our agrarian program and in the struggle for a new democracy, the inalienable right of self-determination of indigenous nations. We commit our efforts to integrate our struggle for land and for a new democracy with the indigenous struggle, which includes rejecting the intervention and control exercised by the old state through its tutelary instrument, FUNAI, as well as the interventions of religious institutions and NGOs, national and foreign, that in the name of, quote, defense of indigenous peoples, end quote, seek to traffic with their interests and serve the interests of the foreign powers. Starting from the recognition that they are original peoples of these lands, thus being communities of the same language, culture, customs, and psychology, inhabiting the same territory, they are, therefore, nationalities in conformation that have passed to the condition of oppressed nationalities in the course of the last 500 years, initially through the process of conquest, genocide, in which the white colonizer imposed himself and took possession of the territories that came to make up Brazil as a new country, and in the continuity of the genocide with the advent and confirmation of the Brazilian state, already in the era of modern capitalist colonialism, imperialism. Just as the poor and exploited white people, the proletariat, are oppressed by this state, founded by the Portuguese colonizers, colonial Brazil, and later exploited by foreign powers, monopolies, and financial capital, semi-colonial Brazil, the indigenous peoples have also continued to be oppressed by the same old state. In the same way, we unconditionally defend the historical claim of the remaining quilombola communities for the lands that, in their resistance against slavery and then against all forms of exploitation, segregation, prejudice, and racism, territories where they built their way of life. The remaining quilombola communities, the most traditional expression of the cultural resistance of black people, always marginalized and at the target of permanent pressure and dispossession of their lands, had, in the years of opportunist management, at the same time, a boost in their mobilization and defense of the demarcation and regularization of claimed, quote, territories, end quote, an institutionalization that led to their corporatization, dependence, and subordination to the opportunist so-called, quote, Workers' Party, end quote, political project. In the old state's search for total control, its policies, with the initiative of the governments of opportunism, posing as a, quote, great achievement, end quote, established the ratification of, quote, quilombola territories, end quote, and the condition of possession for collective usufruct, subordinated to reactionary legislation on subsoil use, equivalent to the tutelage imposed on indigenous lands. The tradition of struggle of the quilombola communities has gone hand in hand, similarly and simultaneously, with the struggle of poor peasants to take possession of land legally belonging to the Union in different historical phases. Moreover, the vast majority of the Brazilian peasantry is composed of black and brown people, and many remaining quilombola communities have remained more closed, but this has never been a basis for conflict and hostility, even though racism, often veiled, has never been overcome. From the recognition of this condition of the indigenous peoples in quilombola communities, we see that these, and all the rest of the Brazilian people, have a common enemy, the old state of big bourgeois and landowners, servants of imperialism. The causes of each one are an integral part of the liberation struggle of our people and our homeland. The single revolutionary front, based on the worker-peasant alliance, so fundamental to the struggle and its triumph, could not be democratic, popular, and revolutionary at all if it did not embrace the indigenous peoples in their historic demand, their right to self-determination, as well as the demands of the quilombola communities. Such an alliance is based on the need for a single revolutionary front, in whose program the construction of a new democratic, popular, and revolutionary state is inscribed and realized. Only on the basis of the recognition of the right to self-determination of the indigenous peoples, which, in a democratic way, with self-decision and self-consent, can be realized. Such a realization, in turn, is only possible in a new democratic republic. 6. The path of the agrarian revolution. The League of Poor Peasants fights to destroy the latifundium, the only way to guarantee land for poor peasants and to prevent the small and medium rural properties continuing to be massacred by their landlords and the government. This struggle for land directly affects the government. The large landowners are part of the class bloc that supports the bourgeois power in the official agrarian policy, just as the institutions, Ministry of Agrarian Development, INCRA, etc., and technical organs, Embrapa, Emater, etc., are to serve their interests and make them viable. The radical struggle against the latifundium, and for their complete destruction, inevitably leads to a clash with the ruling classes as a whole and with the interests of imperialism, which is expressed in the direct confrontation with the repressive legal and police-military apparatus of the state. The agrarian revolution is the banner around which more sectors of society can rally. In this struggle, the peasants have, as their allies, the workers, students, honest intellectuals, the middle class, small and medium-sized merchants, and the popular masses of the city and countryside. The old state and its different administrations, regardless of which party or coalition of parties they are, PFL, PMDB, PSDB, PT, PTB, PCdoB, PP, PL, PSB, PDT, PPS, etc., face the peasant struggle in two different ways, and a combination of them, through repression and through co-optation. 1 hour they use violence against the peasants in struggle, and the next they propose negotiations and agreements, presenting, quote, agrarian reform, end quote, policies and programs just for publicity. With this, the government seeks to put the brakes on the struggle for land, trying to isolate the most militant sectors and co-opting the conciliatory and opportunistic sectors of the movement. As the history of the struggle of the peasants in the country proves, who only through violent forms of struggle have conquered the land, although they have not been able to sustain and maintain them, the recent struggles have shown that in order to conquer the land and develop forms that ensure its conquest, an ever-increasing organization of the peasants is necessary, paying particular attention to the secrecy of the plans for the seizures and the organization of active self-defense. And what is learned from the experience of a capture, its mistakes and successes, should be used as the basis for the continuity of the struggle. 7. The Poor Peasants' League. Principles, objectives, organization, and methods of action. The construction of the Poor Peasants' League. Emerging from the purging process in the peasant movement, the Poor Peasants' League, LSP, has been the result and continuation of the historic struggles for land in the country in general, and particularly of the combative struggle of the Rondônia peasants since the 1970s, whose development culminated in the historic Battle of Santa Helena that, in August 1995, established a watershed and a new phase in the struggle for land, not only in Rondônia, but also throughout the country. Since that crucial moment, the Poor Peasants' League has been fighting to overcome the obstacles that stand in the way of the land struggle, as well as waging a tenacious struggle against opportunism in the midst of the peasant movement in general, and particularly against organizations that seek to drag the movement into conciliation, collaborationism, and to serve as instruments for personal political projects. Throughout these 16 years, the Poor Peasants' League, facing all sorts of difficulties, attacks by the right wing and opportunists, persecution of its leaders by the judiciary, police, and gunmen, intrigues and slander by the government and the bourgeois press, has never tired of fighting, and has active participation in the people's struggle in the country. The Poor Peasants' League has sought, despite its difficulties and weaknesses, to carry out innumerable internal activities of training and of struggle against vices to advance its organization, its leaders, and its grassroots militants. The Poor Peasants' League has considered its main weakness to be overcome as the post-land seizure activities of greater integration, organization, and productive activities in the seized areas, even in those recognized by INCRA as settlement projects. Better and more efficient work in the seized areas is the main and constant challenge. Other problems, such as those of organization at various levels and spheres, finances and training, are also important tasks for the construction and development of the Poor Peasants' League. 8. The general program of the Poor Peasants' League. Why and for whom does the League fight? The League struggles to destroy the latifundium as the only way to achieve a true agrarian transformation, to give the land to those who work on it, to give land to landless poor peasants or those who have little land, and to organize them in such a way as to advance the understanding that only through collective forms of work, in production, storage, commercialization, health, education, and social organization, will it be possible to make their progress possible in the face of the domination of monopoly capital. The League fights for a new agricultural policy aimed at expanding production, fundamentally directed at improving the living conditions of the workers of the countryside, of the city, of the population in general, in the interests of the nation. The League struggles to defend all rural wage workers and to conform with them, and those in the city, to conquer better living and working conditions. Create the agrarian revolution committees in the countryside to organize, advance, and centralize the application of the following program. 1. End of the latifundium and land to the tillers. 2. The land with a social destination, according to the interests of the immense majority of our people and the national interests. 3. Nationalization of the land and nationalization of the large rural capitalist enterprises as the final objective. 4. For a new agricultural and credit policy aimed at making small and medium landowners economically viable. 5. Creation of agro-villages and promotion of agricultural industry in every rural region of the country. 6. Creation of a health system with all necessary infrastructure in the countryside. 7. Creation of an education system centered on the conception of the school of a new type, linked to production and class struggle. 8. Independent social and political organization based on the direct democracy of the people's assemblies. 9. Special policy for the dry, semi-arid Northeast region. 10. Special policy for the Amazon region. End of predatory exploitation and strengthening of the agricultural production according to the vocations of the geographical environment, the interests of the working masses and of the nation. 11. Support for the struggle of the city workers. Develop and strengthen the worker-peasant alliance. 12. Recognition and active support for the self-determination of indigenous nations and peoples. 13. Strengthening and ideological political development of the masses toward the collectivization of the land as a final objective. 14. For a new economy, a new culture, a new politics of new democracy, and a new people's democratic power. 15. Internationalist solidarity with the struggle of the peoples against imperialism and for progress. We emphasize that the fundamental pillars of the agrarian reform that guide and submit all its tasks, and already mentioned above, are 1. Destruction of the latifundium and handing over the land to the landless or nearly landless poor peasants. 2. Liberation of the productive forces of the countryside in the areas seized from the latifundium, through the elimination of all relations of production based on the exploitation of man through the adoption of cooperative forms. The organization and associative forms of the plots and different levels of cooperation according to their experience, from mutual aid groups, an elementary form, to higher forms of cooperation, passing through other levels of cooperative forms. Adoption of more advanced means of production and working tools, and of the most modern techniques. Cooperative organization of the system of production, distribution, commercialization, supply and exchange between the various areas and regions, of the infrastructure such as warehouses, transport, roads, bridges, basic sanitation, etc. 3. Organization and exercise of the political power of the masses in the seized areas. Organization of the various forms of participation of the masses at the different levels for decision-making and the embryo of their self-government, People's Assembly and the People's Committee. Organization of cultural life and its various manifestations. Organization of a mass self-defense system. Organization of the new People's School based on the 3 principles of study, work, and struggle for scientific research, production, and class struggle to liquidate illiteracy and promote the elevation of the scientific and technical knowledge of all. Organize a people's system of preventative and curative health, polyclinics. Nationalization of the big rural capitalist enterprises and control of their production and management by the workers in the areas already taken over. The Poor Peasants League's short, medium, and long-term objectives. In the short and medium term, the Poor Peasants League struggles to develop its organization to transform it into a great popular movement of the peasant masses throughout the country, seeking to unite with all the popular, militant organizations, helping to build the Worker-Peasant Alliance, and to advance the struggle for land, democracy, and justice throughout the country. In the long term, The Poor Peasants League's objective is to strengthen the struggle against the whole bourgeois landlord system that serves imperialism, for its destruction, and for the establishment of people's power to build a new democracy, to conquer the independence and progress of the nation and our people, building socialist society. 9. The Poor Peasants League's mass work. The Poor Peasants League starts from the principle that the center of everything is the masses. It is they who decide everything, and that the masses make history. The land struggle only makes sense if it is centered on the masses as the fundamental force to solve their own problems, to conquer and realize their broad interests. The raison d'etre of this struggle starts from the existence of the masses and the harsh conditions in which they live. To realize the interests of the broad masses, it is indispensable that they organize themselves more and more, acquiring a deep consciousness of their problems and the correct ways to solve them. Nothing and no one can solve the problems of the masses but the masses themselves. Only the masses can transform reality. The Poor Peasants League is a process of building an organization of the poor peasant masses of our country. It is a mass movement that fights for the economic, social, political, and cultural interests of peasants, especially poor peasants. However much a leadership may advance, it can only help as a leading force, because the strength to move obstacles, to clear the way, and to transform reality, only the masses possess and can accomplish this. That is why the Poor Peasants League proposes to its activists to unite with the majority of the masses, to live like them, to learn from them, and to serve them. Exactly because of this, the Poor Peasants League's reason for existence only makes sense if it carries out a permanent and patient work among the masses. This work cannot be any kind of work. It must be of a certain type, that is, class work, that takes place in the political, ideological, cultural, and organic spheres, obeying different stages for its development. Before the land seizure, during it, and after the conquest of land, in the organization of life in the seized area. In general, the mass work in its different stages should, on the political level, raise the most deeply felt demands, point out the origin of the people's suffering, the causes that provoke and maintain the people in misery and under oppression, denouncing the different governments as the stand-in governments of the big bourgeoisie and the landlords in the service of imperialism. We must denounce their policies, as has been happening in the current stage with the so-called, quote, neoliberal, end quote, policy initiated by the Coloch Gemelo government and by FHC, and deepened to extremes by Luis Inácio, who followed the dictates of international finance capital and the orders of the United States, completed the denationalization of the economy, and the surrender of our country through the auctioning of state-owned companies that they call privatizations. They impose cruel unemployment, sowing hunger and misery everywhere. They scrap public services like health, education, and social security. They promote, quote, reforms, end quote, to remove historical rights acquired by workers through much struggle and sacrifice, and to overwhelm the country to the greed of foreign powers and their monopolies. To deepen the work of the masses in the political sphere, it is necessary to clarify these questions in order to raise the fight against such policy, defending a new economic policy aimed at the interests of the immense majority of the Brazilian people and the defense of national interests and sovereignty. On the ideological side, to point out that the system of exploitation and oppression is the world capitalist system, imperialism, that keeps the reactionary classes in power in the oppressed countries with a bureaucratic capitalist system that serves them in the old bureaucratic landlord state, only spreading hunger, disease, death, hate, selfishness, injustice, and oppression to the overwhelming majority of the population. To show that the alternative is class-based socialism, the social system of the workers, and that to achieve this, it is necessary to build the worker-peasant alliance, developing the radical struggle against the latifundium, the big bourgeoisie, and imperialism that they serve, to destroy their rotten system, to conquer people's power that will ensure the construction of the new society. Moreover, it is decisive, in order to strengthen the ideological work of the masses, to educate ourselves from a classist point of view, to spread the ideology of the proletariat, to be clear about the role of the state as an instrument of domination and violence of the bourgeoisie, the landlords, and imperialism. Educate the masses in the struggle against the police, military, and judicial apparatus. Develop and embody the symbols of the struggle, such as the red flag of the movement, the combative songs, and its anthem. In the cultural area, develop the fight against the rotten culture that the latifundium, the bourgeoisie, and imperialism disseminate to maintain their domination, a culture of individualism, egoism, consumerism, and destruction of human values, as well as crushing all manifestations of national and people's culture, imposing a true brainwashing through the control of the mass media and the dissemination of music, soap operas, publications, a true cultural pornography. Develop and promote popular culture, especially with music, dance, and theater, and stimulate, organize, and develop physical education and the various kinds of sports. In the organic side, patiently develop the organization based on people's democracy, strengthening the mass work as a determining element and the permanent promotion of increasing participation of the masses in the leadership bodies. The creation and strengthening of nuclei and base groups is fundamental to ensure a greater rooting of the movement, besides intensifying mass participation in the commissions for different issues, thus raising the commitment and political consciousness of the masses. Develop and stimulate the organization of women, youth, and children, building specific organizations that can ensure greater activity in these sectors. Spread the importance of discipline, of correct behavior towards the enemy, and life in general. Life in the camps in conquered areas. The encampment period and its regime imposes many restrictions. It should be as short as possible. The objective of the movement is not to form camps, which is a necessity, but constitute a transitory phase. In general, life in the camps and in the areas seized have to be regulated by a set of norms that are approved by the General Assembly of the camp and area, according to the disciplinary definitions of the movement. Specifically, during the encampment period, the regime with disciplinary norms defined by the movement will be in force. In the areas, the regime should be defined and improved permanently by the People's Assembly. Life in the encampments and areas must be regulated by rights and duties applied to everyone, and its definition process must go through broad discussions with the masses. To ensure a greater organization of life in these places, the whole masses should be part of one of the commissions in charge of the different activities that concern their functioning, such as the distribution of activities and responsibilities in the camps, camp coordination, security, collective kitchen, cleaning and sanitary conditions, collection of warm clothes and food, agitation, assemblies, parties, acts, demonstrations, finances, education, health, culture. In the case of the conquered areas, the same level of organization must be reproduced, but it is necessary to observe the degree of development of the consciousness of the masses, the particularities of each area, with the objective of constantly seeking to raise the level of organization, so that the maximum number of members of that area have the most effective participation in collective life. The production question. The struggle for production is the most immediate and important objective for the masses, and is decisive to ensure the development and sustainability of the land struggle. All our activity must be based on the work of organizing and making production possible. The masses struggle to own a plot of land in order to organize their lives and that of their families, meaning they struggle initially for individual ownership of the land. The Poor Peasants' League recognizes and supports this right of the masses and fights to show them that in the face of the existence of the latifundium and the land monopoly, small individual production has little to no viability, and in general reinforces the bourgeois ideology of ownership over means of production and labor exploitation. It must be shown that the way to face both problems is cooperation, starting with the simplest forms of mutual aid in production, developing it into higher and more advanced forms of cooperativization, with the complete collectivization in the countryside as the objective. But only practice, through persistence and concrete experience in the long term, will lead the masses to understand that collectivization is the only alternative. For this, it is necessary to stimulate, all the time and patiently, forms of collective work, association of private plots for collective production and distribution/commercialization. However, it is crucial to understand that we must help those who still don't understand and don't accept these forms, always encouraging them to organize themselves in cooperatives and mutual aid associations, permanently debating the differences and advantages between one form and another. Once the land seizure is complete, it is decisive to begin the work of collective farming, trying to strengthen the self-sustainability of each camp as much as possible. During the encampment period, we must fight so that all forms of organization are carried out in a collective way, particularly production. In the sphere of production, the movement aims to stimulate and advance as much as possible the viability of collective production processes, but without in any way imposing them on the masses. The same efforts and objectives are necessary for the commercialization of production. Health and education. In the daily life of the camps and settlements, we must work hard to solve the problems of education and health. The responsible committees must take the initiative in not allowing these issues to take a back seat. Struggling for the government to provide the conditions for regular schooling in these areas is decisive and important for two reasons. First, for ensuring the permanence of families who have children of school age. Second, to guarantee the regular education of all children as a fundamental and necessary right for their development. The movement must fight to gain the sympathy of teachers to apply the conception of the school of a new type, conception of education linked to production and the class struggle, according to the goals of the movement. Until this goal is achieved in each area, the peasant family school should be organized immediately, with the same conception, but completely supported by the peasants themselves in each area. Improving the literacy and education of children, young people, and adults is of vital importance for the movement and for the struggle. In the same way, the health question should receive the same attention, seeking to make possible health centers and periodic visits by professionals to the areas, paying special attention to the health problems of women and children. The organization of campaigns and disease prevention actions is of great value. The implementation and maintenance of general cleaning, ensuring the necessary conditions for collective hygiene, as well as services that improve sanitation, water and sewage, contribute to the organization and general well-being of the camp and the areas taken. To execute such activities, it is extremely important to prepare as many health promoters as possible. Sports, entertainment, and culture. We must stimulate, organize, and promote sports, leisure, and cultural activities, arts and literature, as much as possible to assure a complete and healthy development of the masses, particularly the youth and children. Such activities are also decisive in stimulating the youth not to withdraw from the encampments, from the areas taken over, and from the struggle itself for the land and for the new society. The correct moral conduct. One of the most important struggles that must be fought daily within the movement, the encampments, and the areas is to encourage everyone to adopt a correct behavior as a determining factor to destroy all the rottenness of the hypocritical, individualistic, selfish, dishonest, and corrupt bourgeois morals. The fight for our major objectives can only triumph if we build from now on a new form of coexistence and relationship based on collectivism. Fighting all incorrect attitudes, not covering them up, not conciliating them with frivolous, rascal, clever, disloyal, and disintegrating behaviors, no matter who they come from, is the main struggle that we can carry out to forge collective morale and trust, and foster the growth of each individual. Systematically practicing criticism and self-criticism is the right way to fight the evils that bourgeois society forces into all of us. The society for which we fight and dream of achieving one day, socialism, is made of collective fraternity and solidarity, which we must practice right now. Let us fight to transform our organization into embryos of the future society. One of the issues to be highlighted in this struggle is to confront the problem of alcoholism and other drugs. We all know how destructive it is for human beings from the point of view of physical and mental health, along with social and family life. The capitalist society stimulates and facilitates the use of drugs for two reasons. The first is that it represents a fabulous business where billions are profited. The second is that drugs and alcoholism are efficient instruments to keep the masses away from the real understanding of their problems, making them apathetic and unbelieving, facilitating their exploitation and domination. Relationship with state organizations and agencies. In the struggle against the old state, whether it is for the demands most required by the masses or for building our organization, we have to confront its federal, state, and municipal agencies. The entire policy of the different governments is not aimed at meeting any of our interests. On the contrary, the old state, through its shifting administrations, seeks to demoralize us and destroy our struggle. In our relations with governmental bodies, we must always remain vigilant and alert. The enemy uses these relationships to try to achieve its objectives. When the government pretends to meet a demand, we can't rely on promises and boast of victory. The enemy is treacherous and uses this nonsense to discredit the leadership before the masses. Not trusting, not believing, only carrying out understandings that are correct in the open and in the presence of the masses, pressuring them all the time is our task. We must take into account that the so-called, quote, negotiation, end quote, is an artifice that the exploiters have developed to destroy the combative popular organizations. The, quote, negotiations, end quote, appear in moments of conflict as a tool to destabilize the position of strength that a movement develops, and that threatens the power of the exploiters. It is necessary that everyone be very well prepared for the clashes against the hard forms, repression, and soft forms, negotiations, employed by our enemies. Relationship with NGOs. A question that requires the greatest attention is the possible relationship with NGOs, non-governmental organizations, which are sprouting everywhere. In the Amazon regions, there are thousands of them. A large part of these institutions are instrumentalized from abroad. They are financed by imperialist institutions destined to corrupt, domesticate, and destroy the militant organizations of the peoples of the oppressed countries. Regarding NGOs as a whole, we must be vigilant about them. NGOs have not come into being for their self-proclaimed goals. They are part of a deliberate policy on an international scale, aimed primarily at interfering in oppressed countries such as ours. This policy aims to involve, quote, needy communities, end quote, minorities, end quote, such as indigenous people, those in defense of, quote, gender, end quote, women, quote, environmental protection, end quote, such as, quote, defense of the Amazon forest, end quote, etc. These organizations appear with a lot of financial resources and start financing health projects, agricultural development, production, environmental preservation, defense of human rights, etc. This is a policy destined to create a whole parallel structure to the state, while the state is being disengaged from such obligations through, quote, reforms, end quote, promoted by the governments. This is a strategy of international capital to remove from the state any public service activity in favor of the people. Later on, these organizations will claim their financial resources have run out, having fulfilled their role. In addition, they play the role of corrupting popular leaders through paychecks, changes in their living standards, distancing themselves from their mass bases, etc. Many of these organizations house agents from foreign power governments destined to spy on and infiltrate the militant people's organizations. Some are controlled by honest people who truly intend to support the people's struggle. Knowing them well, we should seek to establish relations in favor of organizing and strengthening the struggle, but always remaining alert and vigilant. Relationship with the press. The press is another sector with which we need to be very careful in our relationship. In general, the means of information and communication are under the strong control of the big bourgeoisie, and their objective is to manipulate reality, to lie, to misinform, to keep the people under their influence. In the face of the people's struggle, the media, the press, increasingly plays a decisive role in favor of the enemy. Today, it is the main instrument of information, mapping, internal knowledge of the organizations in the struggle and of distorting these organizations' supposed objectives in order to create a negative image of the proletarian and peasant struggles. In our relationship with the press, we must be vigilant and act in an extremely organized and objective way to reduce to the maximum the margins of manipulation and distortion of the information that we are interested in passing on to the public opinion. We must be especially alert for the co-optation techniques in which the press, the global television network, have specialized in, through promotion and deification, creating illusions of the personal importance of the leadership. We must fight against all these instruments of the enemy, acting firmly, energetically, and without contemplation towards them. Every relationship with these bodies must be done in a planned way through responsible people, defined by the organization and according to the interests of the organization. Who are our friends and enemies? To clearly and objectively define who we are in our arduous struggle, our true friends and who are our sworn enemies is also a fundamental question for the strengthening and success of our movement. Generally speaking, our friends are all those who are directly or indirectly benefiting from the results of the struggle for land, and who will fully benefit from them in the future. They are those who already have a democratic and honest conscience. In other words, the workers in the city and the countryside, the people in general. They are the small rural and urban landowners, small businessmen, students, teachers, honest intellectuals, sincere, quote, politicians, end quote, of rare existence in the country, unions, popular organizations, and those that defend the rights of the people. We should be suspicious of many bodies that claim to defend, quote, human rights, end quote, since they are usually NGOs or state bodies, committed artists, and progressive religious people. Our enemies are the landowners, the big landowners, landlords, and their gangs of gunmen, the big businessmen, the big bourgeoisie, and its parties full of corrupt politicians, the electoral parties that call themselves, quote, leftist, end quote, the government bodies, the, quote, justice, end quote, bureaucracy, and the repressive police-military apparatus. There are still some sectors that we could call, quote, middle sectors, end quote, among which many we will need to neutralize and attract other parts of the sector to our struggle. The necessity of protecting ourselves. Self-defense of the masses. For all the reasons that the struggle for land implies, from historical conditions, such as the present ones, the movement cannot have the naivete of expecting any democratic treatment from the old state and the latifundium. Drawing the lessons from historical experience and weighing everything that has happened in the struggle for land in Brazil, it is a necessity and a moral obligation to assume all the necessary tasks to defend our movement and our organizations from the different types of attacks from our enemies. To keep the situation unchanged, the old Brazilian state and the latifundium have vast experience and will spare no effort to destroy any organization that goes against their interests and that mainly works concretely to transform the land situation and destroy their system of exploitation and oppression. The system not only uses all the instruments that the state has to repress and destroy our struggle, but also counts on innumerable political and paramilitary organizations to carry out its criminal plans. To make the masses aware of this repression, of the real and true concept of the state, and of what the old Brazilian state is in essence, of its role, as well as denouncing the action of the gunman gangs, is decisive. The old state, together with the press, tries to defame and mischaracterize all combative social struggles, seeking then to criminalize them in order to justify all repression against them. But it's not enough simply to denounce their methods and objectives. It is necessary to fight them with firmness and determination. And this can only be done by defining a policy of self-defense and preparing the whole movement to exercise it. Facing the need for self-defense, many activities must be developed and organized. Starting with the participation of everyone in the defense of our organization, of the masses, and of our leaders, who are the main target of elimination by the enemy. The permanent vigilance against the enemy's infiltration, the vigilance on the enemy's movement, the permanent obtaining of information from the enemy, and counter-information are indispensable activities for our protection, and in which everyone should participate. Protecting the identity of the most exposed comrades is also important and necessary. In the acts that lead to confrontation, one must be minimally prepared, so as not to facilitate the enemy's bandit and criminal action. In the confrontations necessary to achieve our objectives, in the land seizures and occupation of administrative organs of the old state, it is necessary to use camouflage and face covering to protect the identity of our comrades. Educate the masses about the historical experience of the struggle of the peoples and of our Brazilian people, whose conquests, whatever they may be, were only possible through violent struggle. Educate the masses that the enemy permanently exercises criminal violence against the people, and that the people have the sacred right to defend themselves by resorting to just violence. Raise the slogan, quote, "The rebellion is justified," end quote. Disciplinary and operating norms. Article 1. To ensure the proper functioning of the different relationships within the camps and other areas, it is necessary to establish disciplinary rules, based on rights and duties to which everyone, without any exception, is bound. Article 2. The supreme decision-making body of the collective is its General Assembly. The functioning of these bodies is based on democratic centralism. That is, everyone participates in the discussions and decisions, approved unanimously or by majority. Once decisions have been made, everyone is obliged to put them into practice. The fraternal practice of criticism and self-criticism is the means to seek the overcoming of failures and errors. Article 3. The rights of all members of the camps and areas, as well as of the nucleus of preparation for new decisions, are to participate in the definitions of the directions of the struggle and for the life of the collective, to elect and to be elected for the different instances of direction, to criticize, in public or privately, the leaders and any member of the collective. Article 4. It is the duty of everyone, without any exception, to defend the unity of the collective, to watch over and be vigilant against the disruptors, to fulfill the tasks for which they were elected, periodically rendering accounts to the movement and to all interested parties, to help in the political and material construction of the movement, to keep the movement's secrets, and to pay contributions democratically defined by the collective's assembly. Article 5. Anyone who has been sanctioned for acts of indiscipline in violation of the rules will be barred from exercising the right to elect and be elected for leading positions. Article 6. The carrying, use, and sale of alcoholic beverages and any type of drug is strictly forbidden inside the camp. It is forbidden to carry, use, and trade drugs and alcoholic beverages in the areas. Article 7. It is expressly forbidden to practice or advocate discrimination based on race, religion, and gender, sex. Article 8. The practice or any apology of prostitution, gambling, and other forms of moral corruption is expressly forbidden. Article 9. The sale or business involving ownership rights, lots, land, or any object related to the conquest of the collective struggle is strictly forbidden. Article 10. It is strictly forbidden to supply information about the internal life of the organization and the collective to strangers, agents of the landowners, and the state. Article 11. Non-compliance with Articles 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are considered serious violations, which will be punished with special punishments defined by the People's Court, formed by the General Assembly of the collective. Article 12. Other violations will be sanctioned based on the disciplinary measures referred to in Article 13, applied by the organization to which it is connected, commission, work group, etc. Disciplinary measures. Article 13. According to the seriousness of the violations, measures range from a simple warning and a formalized and public criticism of the collective, removal from office and loss of rights to elect, be elected, and to receive information about the direction of the movement for a determined period of time, expulsion from the movement, expulsion from the collective. Article 14. Any and all forms of collaboration with the enemy and betrayal are considered acts of treason. Article 15. The acts considered treasonous will be immediately sanctioned, as soon as they are proven, with dishonorable expulsion from the movement and the collective. Article 16. All those accused of violations will have the right to a full defense before the investigation commissions in the body responsible for forwarding the process. 10. How the Poor Peasants League organizes. The Poor Peasants League is based on organized peasants, in the encampments, in the areas seized, and the nucleus of poor peasants mobilized for new land occupations. In each of these places, the highest decision-making body are the assemblies, where all the companions have the right to participate, to vote on the proposals that are presented, to elect and to be elected for the commissions that are constituted. The tasks to be accomplished must always be the responsibility of a committee of companions, always seeking the participation of new people in the work. With this, excessive decentralization is avoided and the development of new leadership is made possible. The decisions taken and the commitments made must be accountable to the collective. Whoever has taken on a task must be accountable to the collective for the work done. The coordination of camps and areas, commissions, and organizational sectors. Several tasks arise in the organization and mobilization of the camps and areas: security, collective production, food and collective kitchen, cleaning and health, education and training, collection and control of finances, mobilization of women, youth, children, etc., youth, women, children. For the execution of these tasks, it is important to form commissions or sectors, trying to involve as many people as possible in the tasks. The members of each commission or sector should elect a coordinator to direct the work. The coordinator should be elected in the assembly of members of camps and of the areas. It should meet regularly to discuss the problems that arise and to accompany and coordinate the work of the commissions or sectors. The coordination is a collegiate governing body, where the collective should always be strengthened, fighting the deviations of individualism, bossism, careerism, and personalism. The coordination in the commissions, or sectors, must always be able to render accounts of their work and their acts in the assemblies and meetings with the bases. Special attention must be given to the rendering of accounts of financial activities, collection and expenditure, and the control of the use of the collective patrimony. The administration of the movement's resources and assets will always be done by the Finance Committee, never by a single person. The regional coordination. The regional coordination is elected in the Poor Peasants League meetings of the region. A region is composed of parts of states, from the official political division, where the delegates chosen in the various camps and areas run by the movements participate. Commissions and sectors should also be organized in the regional coordination, which will help the development of the same commissions and sectors in the camps and areas. At the regional level, a press commission will be organized that will take care of the elaboration of notes, pamphlets, and newspapers of the Poor Peasants League. The Council of Representatives. The Council of Representatives is to be formed by one or more members of each camp or area at the regional level. Its character is that of an advisory body, being able to call the meeting of delegates or extraordinary meetings of the coordination by decision of 2/3 of its components. The Congress. The Congress is a mass instance of emulative character and of cohesion of the movement, open to the participation of the bases that must organize their participation by camp and area. The Congress may or may not endorse the decisions made by the regional delegates' meetings. The role of the leadership. The leaders of the Poor Peasants' League, at any level, should be examples of discipline, seriousness, moral uprightness, and responsibility in the fulfillment of their tasks. They should be an example of combativeness, solidarity, and commitment to the objectives and program of the movement. They must be firm in the confrontation with the enemy, always careful to prepare the masses to face the violence that the latifundium and the old state practice against them. The leadership must not be deceived by the flattery that the government, the press, the landlords, and the politicians sometimes show to the leaders of the people. This is always to buy them, to take them out of the struggle. The companion that assumes the function of the leadership must understand that they will always be subject to greater pressure, that they must always be the first person to comply with the decisions of the bases, and that everyone will be vigilant about their political and moral conduct. A leader must never use his position as a member of the board of directors to take advantage for his own interests or for personal projects. Nobody is obliged to accept the function of direction. But if they have accepted it, they know that their responsibilities are greater. If they think that they are not able to assume them, they should resign. The leadership must be thoughtful, patient, simple, and humble when dealing with the masses, serving them wholeheartedly. They should always be concerned with developing, studying, and participating in courses and training activities organized by the movement. The leadership must take special care to always support and stimulate the participation of women. Without the participation and the organized presence of women, our movement has no chance of victory in its objectives. Our struggle will be hard and long. That is why it is also important to integrate young people and children in the struggle. Stimulate study, sport, culture, develop in them a love for the land, and incorporate them early into the fight against the latifundium. Seize all lands of the latifundium. Long live the agrarian revolution. Conquer the land. Original version by Benedito Monteiro. Current version by Carlos Prechedes. Now we set out to our fight for the land that is ours to occupy. The land belongs to the tiller. History won't fail. We will win. Enough of so much suffering. Enough of so much waiting. The struggle will be very difficult. No matter how long it takes, we will win. Those who like us are ourselves, and those who come to our help. So trust those in the struggle. History won't fail. We will win. If we are to die in this fight, our blood will become a seed. We will conquer our justice. History won't fail. We will win. We are already 30 million, the people with no land, with no bread. Our road is to fight for our soil. History won't fail. We will win. Enough of so much suffering. Enough of so much waiting. The struggle will be very difficult. No matter how long it takes, we will win.